Good to be back again for everybody for this week. We got a few little changes. You don't see the energetic Tim Watros with us this week, one of our partners with Digital Advisors, but we've got a very good replacement in Lindsay Dyer, who's joining us from Digital Advisors. Hey, Lindsay, how are you doing?
Hey, Kevin, great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
You bet. And Tim is out for elective ankle surgery, I understand. So I think he's in a little bit of pain. Otherwise, he would have been with us this week. But we are also joined by the legendary Jack O'Connell. Hey, Jack, thanks for joining.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you for inviting me.
You betcha. So, Lindsay, we got a pretty good agenda this week, huh?
We do indeed. And I was hoping, Jack, you could kick it off by discussing the progress with the state budget this week.
Thank you, Lindsay. Happy to. And I think the reason that Lindsay and Tim and Kevin invited me, because I have so much practical on the job experience, not having a real budget adopted on time. Having served 20 years in the legislature, I think we had maybe three budgets that actually passed on time. And the rules of the game have clearly changed. There was an initiative on the ballot in 2010 that the voters, in my opinion, wisely passed. They created this majority vote budget. I believe it was Prop 25. And it said that if the budget doesn't pass by June 15th, which would have been this Monday of this week, then our friends in the legislature do not get paid. And so we knew that a budget would pass, but it's not the final budget. The real budget's still being negotiated with amongst three people. It's being negotiated with the governor, the speaker of the assembly, and the president pro tem of the Senate. Now, we're told that they're very close on most of the issues. The big issues that concern us in education would be the deferrals vis-a-vis tax, vis-a-vis cuts, actual cuts. Should there be COLA or not? How should we treat the categorical programs? Just a whole list. But I can tell you, having been there for, as I mentioned earlier, a long time, this is the period of uncertainty. It's uncertainty for the members of the legislature. The state assembly actually went home to begin their 4-week break, but they're on call, so they can't really leave California because they might have to come back. The state Senate's scheduled for 2 more weeks. So although the Assembly and the Senate were on the same page with respect to the education budget, they weren't on the same page in terms of the summer calendar. And then the legislature is scheduled to come back on July 13th. And once there is an agreement and all of the details are ironed out on the budget, then the measure must be in print for 72 hours, 3 days, so that we in the public have ample opportunity to review and analyze the budget as it goes forward. But I might ask Kevin, who's in Sacramento. Kevin, can you fill us in on some of the latest proposals, the agreements that you've heard about?
Yeah, thanks, Jack. So we're pretty confident we're looking at a budget agreement that's pretty much baked. Now, they've got to sew up some of the details, I think, with regard to Trader Bill language, some of those details. That's what's hanging things up right at the moment. Once the leadership gets to that agreement, then they call folks back for what will be a vote after that 72-hour public notice requirement that Jack referenced. What we do know about the budget plan that's being put together, because we're getting this information from a bunch of different sources, is that we are fortunately looking at a budget that is a no-cut budget in K-12 education. The real question has been out there about whether or not we see a COLA or not. I think it's all but been decided that we probably will not get a COLA per se, but we're anticipating that there'll be some kinds of adjustments in this budget that will give us money beyond what just the current year would give us. One of the hints on that was conversations about wanting to take that $4.4 billion in federal money that comes in two different ways. Part of it is special ed. Another part is a distribution that goes out based primarily on poverty types of index. Concentration grant is one of the big issues that was talked about a lot in the governor's budget. And adding some money to that and having some of that come to school districts in a different way, those details haven't been worked out. But we know that in its totality, that we're probably looking at money that will go beyond just the current year, so that we have more than just a baseline 1920 level funding. It'll be something beyond that. So that's kind of what we're looking at. There are a lot of other details that, are coming out of the process. One that's going to get to an agenda item we'll talk about in a minute. But I did also want to mention that news that's sort of coming out this week, you can expect probably some trader bill language related in some way. We don't have the specifics, but to the issue of our funding police on school campuses. So campus-based or district-based sworn officers and police forces may end up being drawn into the controversy that we've been seeing over the last week or so. So that'll be a new issue that we're going to need to grapple with for sure.
And of course, the two big unknowns, Kevin, would be how much money actually is coming into the state. I mean, again, postponing the April 15th date till July 15th. The reality is we're not going to know in terms of the anticipated taxes, the taxes that you still owe from the last year until all of those envelopes are open the last week of July. And then the unknown in the federal government. Are we going to have an additional measure to help bail out economic stimulus? I think we believe that we will. We've been working on that, trying to get as much information, contacting some of the key folks, people with contacts, Republican members in the Senate, but that's probably not going to happen until the end of July.
Right. I mean, and frankly, Jack, you've been really helpful. Jack has, and I've seen it personally when we've been back there in Washington, D.C., a really great relationship with the speaker and really a very good relationship, honestly, with the minority leader, Kevin McCarthy, as well. So the fact that we have two leaders from California that we're pretty familiar with has sort of helped us in our ability to try to make sure they both know the imperative for California school districts on a fifth round of stimulus if we're to get it. But the other thing, Jack, that you mentioned that's important is that July 15th deadline on when we file taxes and we start getting information about our revenue after that, and the unknowns about the federal money are some of the reasons why some around the capital community have sort of forecast a very late budget. I don't think that's going to happen because, again, I think there's an incredible amount of agreement right now. We are expecting this in days, not weeks, but we'll see whether or not we're right. Now, I also like to condition that on, you guys all know that you've been watching these, that we're told one day that we're going to get the guidance from CDE, like the very next day. We would relay that to you, and then it would be yet another week. That got delayed almost 2 weeks, almost 3 weeks before we finally saw it. Hopefully that's not the case with this budget. We think things are really imminent. And the problem is for them is that once enough of the details start getting out and being public, then I think it compels them to just get it done. So I think the longer they wait, the more information that ends up getting around Sacramento, it precludes them from taking the action they would otherwise be inclined to just get done. So I think they're going to move probably a little bit faster. I'm expecting a budget announcement any day, but then they, as Jack mentioned, after they get done with that 72-hour notice, I think they're calling people back to Sacramento to get this voted on.
And perhaps the last point we can make, Kevin, is we're well known for the budget workshops that we do around the state, and we're going to do them virtually. We were initially going to schedule them to begin this coming Monday, and we have postponed them until we know when the budget is actually agreed upon. So we will let everybody know if you registered with our budget workshop scheduled to start next week, they're postponed. But as soon as we know, we will communicate with you again.
Yeah, and what I'm told, Jack, about that is that I think we have the capability to actually just, once we get the location and the time, we can actually just move you for you, and then you would get a notice of what the new date and time is. Hopefully it works for you. If it doesn't, I know we're doing a number of these different workshops. We prefer that and we think for your sake, you're going to want to be in the county that you're in. But if you needed to be in a different presentation, you'll just see the face of a different county superintendent when we do the presentation. But yes, we'll get those logistics worked out and we'll get that out to you guys so that you know what's going on.
And Kevin, a big issue that I know you've been involved in also is dealing with a potential August layoff notices. The March 15th may happen in August if certain thresholds aren't met in terms of revenue coming in. What's the latest on that?
Yeah, there is some controversy stirring for sure about rumored trader bill language that would preclude any sort of layoff authority by school districts, both for certificated and classified, And believe me, there's a lot of conversation going on. Labor is working on this issue. It is a priority to labor. I think a lot of this hinges a little bit on just how much money is in this budget. I think that to the degree that we not only get a level funding for 1920 going into next year, but they actually provide an amount equal to what would be COLA, I think you're going to see a greater likelihood of them trying to preclude us from utilizing what the law would otherwise grant us, which is some layoff authority on certificated employees whenever we get less than 2% increase to the LCFF. And so we're going to take a look at the way what money might flow and how that flows to see how the outcome of that issue. A lot of concern, as you can imagine, that if it's a flat year, there is no COLA, and you take away layoff authority, a lot of concern there, given the fact that we've got a lot of expenses. Districts, frankly, they were doing budget cuts, many of them, before there was ever this thing called COVID. And so, how do you, when you're in a cutting mode, I mean, there's several examples out there, West Contra Costa, I think about, that's got very big cuts that they're going to have to make regardless of how this budget turns out. It's just the magnitude of cuts that they're looking at. How do you do those if your hands are tied on both certificated and classified layoffs? It creates some real challenges there. I don't think the education community is ungrateful at all for an incredibly bold legislature to stand up for decent funding for public education that avoids cuts. But at the same time, people are trying to be practical about the tools that we have at the local level. It really should be between management and labor at the local level, not at the state level. But that's getting hashed out as we speak. We'll see where it goes. We could end up losing some authority on certificated layoffs, which has happened a couple of times before, and maybe retain the layoff authority on classified, or it could be taken away authority over all of it. It's hard to tell where this is headed, but believe me, there's a lot of activism and lobbying going on today on this issue, this very issue. It'll go through the weekend, and until we have a budget, there's going to be a lot of voices raised about this.
Kevin, thank you so much. And, we're hearing a lot about mask or not to mask, and counties across the state have been employing varying mandates. What are we hearing today about mask policy statewide?
Yeah, really important issue. And I saw the announcement yesterday very early, as soon as it came over. And you guys may know that the press release and the formal announcement by the administration didn't mention anything about schools. You'd had to look at the fine print, not on that document, but on an accompanying document to see a very fuzzy reference that once we checked out with the administration, they clarified did indeed mean that while there's going to be a requirement, a mandatory requirement for masks outside of the home in almost every kind of walk of life, that schools and childcare centers would be exempted. And just puzzled about that. But as we looked into it, one of the sort of the narrative from the administration is that we know that they have time and again leaned on the notion of local control. And in this case, while they definitely have a disposition to suggest that masks be worn, that ultimately a lot of guidance has been given out to schools that they wanted to leave that discretion up to locals with a strong emphasis on mask use. The last part of that, the strong emphasis on mask use, wasn't really evident, but we understand from the administration today that there'll be some strong guidance from the Department of Health for the state of California that will, in fact, give us much more stern advice about the wearing of masks in school settings. So that's to come. Definitely a new wrinkle on the mask thing. I know there was a lot of frustration in school districts all across the state. One of them is just frankly a liability issue, which is if the announcement itself says there's a requirement that everybody use them, but then sort of in some small, very vague terms, it suggests that there's an exemption for schools when there's nothing in writing that provides an exemption. There's no real legal document or requirement or announcement by the state that's more formal about in an exception. What kind of liability for a school district, regardless of which way you go on this, is really, really uncomfortable. So we're expecting actually to this to get clarified by the state and we're expecting that guidance very soon as well. But I did want to let you know that we did a communications directly with administration today, and they said that that extra guidance that is going to lean toward the idea of masks being worn in public schools is on its way.
Thank you, Kevin. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead,
And,
Jack.
and then I just wanted to kind of turn the page. And as you know, the coronavirus, we've seen last figures I saw, 23 states have actually seen an increase this past week, including California, in the number of documented cases. And we're in with states like Arizona, Texas, Oklahoma, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, a lot of the South, and many in the West, including Oregon. And so I know that there was just recently this week an assembly committee hearing on reopening. And there are so many different ideas and methods and strategies. I know our friends in San Diego County have been in the forefront at putting forth many different ideas. Should it be all distance learning? Should it be business as usual? Should you have half the kids come in the morning, half in the afternoon for social distancing? Some schools are talking about maybe it's 3 days a week and use Saturday school. What type of hybrid or blended learning? Can you fill us in on what you heard? I know you monitored the assembly hearing this week for reopening.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad you brought that up. One of the things, because I was referencing liability relative to masks a second ago, but one of the issues that actually came out of that hearing, and it kind of led the news, there were two takeaways to me. The sleeper was how big a deal liability got. And honestly, it was Katie McNamara from South Bay School Districts down in San Diego County, as you mentioned, who led that. She was representing the Superintendent's Council of AXA, did a great job of articulating sort of the issues on this. And so much so that the chairman of the committee, Patrick O'Donnell, ended up being quoted, as well as really the sentiment of the entire committee, that something's got to be done relative to this broad issue of liability that we have, that we need some kind of indemnification because people are going to end up suing people because that's what happens. And there are certain things that we just can't control for in schools. Even if you do your level best and you're following all the guidance that's been produced, you shouldn't have to have or worry about liability on top of that. So a very big issue coming out of the hearing. The other thing, Jack, that I thought was interesting was the questions. There were questions put by Assemblymember Kevin McCarty of Sacramento, who's chair of the budget subcommittee. He was asking questions of Linda Darling Hammond about what does she honestly think is the capability of districts to be able to function in sort of the brick and mortar setting if in fact we have to absorb cuts to public education. We get some kind of reductions, or we're going to have to cut budgets at all. What does she realistic think about that? And you know, I think she's been very strongly an advocate for making sure that schools get restarted again, and that a totally exclusively distance learning approach is not going to be acceptable by any school district wide. But it was great to hear her acknowledge, and I hope it put pressure on the overall budget process to say school districts are likely not to be able to function well at all. And many schools are going to find themselves unable to do direct physical instruction in school buildings if in fact they're trying to shoulder deep budget cuts at the same time. So we really appreciated that candor during the hearing, and I think it was a real important takeaway in that hearing, in addition to the liability issue.
And you've seen this at colleges and universities as well. I know football teams, I think Ohio State, they asked their players to sign a waiver, removing any potential liability from the football program or the university in the event of a sickness or illness.
Yep,
Big
no,
issue.
good point. Very good. Now, I don't know if we're quite there yet, but I know there was an issue regarding Zoom calls that everybody's been using all over the place. Lindsay, you had some thoughts about, or some news actually, about what's going on with that issue this week.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. So, three months into the shelter in place, we're all using Zoom, and many teachers are leveraging Zoom to teach their classes. And there was some concern raised, specifically in the state of New York, around the security of the Zoom platform. And obviously, student privacy and student data is of utmost importance, and we want to work to ensure that all student data is secure. Zoom on Wednesday announced that all users of the Zoom platform, be it free or paid, are now offering end-to-end encryption. So that is huge news because they're really the first company of its kind to offer this kind of add-on service. And the impact on education is really exciting because it's going to help increase the security of student information, teacher information being shared on the Zoom platform. So this is definitely something to celebrate. It's a move in the right direction. And, based on much of what you guys have just said around reopening, it's clear that distance learning will continue to play a role. And so leveraging platforms like Zoom will continue to be a part of the distance learning paradigm. So this kind of added security of end-to-end encryption is a real bonus to the distance learning new normal that we've now found ourselves in.
That's going to have a real impact on Jack's ability to Zoom bomb people, right?
I think it might.
Okay, was there anything else on the agenda that I missed, Lindsay?
No, that's it. That takes us through our agenda for today.
Great. Well, listen, everybody, thank you so much. Thank you, Lindsay. Great job. Jack, it was great to have you this week.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks, Kevin.
Yep.
Lindsay.
We'll see y'all next week.